March 22, 1847. Veracruz, Mexico. The first American shell struck the city wall at dawn, and Captain Ignacio Mora pressed his hands over his ears, waiting for the silence that always followed artillery fire. The silence never came. What Mexican defenders witnessed that spring morning would shatter every assumption they held about warfare, discipline, and the industrial capacity of their northern enemy, and it would cost Mexico half its territory before the guns finally fell quiet. The landing had begun 13 days earlier. Captain Mora, a 12-year veteran who had fought in 3 civil wars and countless skirmishes, watched from the parapets as American boats deposited soldiers on the beaches south of the city. 9,000 men came ashore in a single day, moving with the mechanical precision of clockwork. No confusion, no delays, just endless boats shuttling back and forth like worker ants building a colony. Mora's commander, General Juan Morales, gathered his officers on the evening of March 21st. The stone-walled meeting room still held the day's heat, and the air tasted of lime dust and tobacco smoke. Morales spread a map across the scarred wooden table. "They will bombard us tomorrow," he said, tapping the coastal batteries the Americans had been constructing. "Standard siege tactics. They will fire, assess damage, adjust their aim. Between salvos, we repair the walls and rotate our men. This is how sieges work. This is how they have always worked." Mora nodded along with the other officers. He had seen enough artillery duels to know the rhythm. Guns heated up. Crews needed rest. Ammunition had to be rationed. Every army operated under these constraints. Even the Americans, for all their size and swagger, would have to pause. They were catastrophically wrong. The bombardment began at first light. Mora was stationed on the northeastern wall, commanding 42 men armed with a mixture of British smoothbores and captured carbines. The wall beneath his boots was 4 feet thick, stone and lime mortar that had stood for generations. It had repelled pirates and privateers. It would hold. The first shell, a 24-pound ball fired from a naval gun the Americans had hauled ashore, struck 30 feet to his left. The impact produced a white cloud that smelled faintly of burnt plaster as mortar vaporized. Stone fragments peppered the defenders. One man screamed, clutching his face where a marble-sized chunk had opened his cheek. Before the dust settled, the second shell arrived, then the third. Then a sound like rolling thunder kept close to the earth, a continuous hammering that made individual explosions impossible to distinguish. Mora crouched behind a merlin and counted the seconds between impacts, trying to find the pattern. 5 seconds, 4 seconds, 3 seconds, 6 seconds. There was no pattern. The guns simply never stopped. By mid-morning, the rhythm had become machine-like. Load, aim, fire. Load, aim, fire. 3-minute cycles performed by battery after battery, each gun crew rotating so the barrels never cooled, the ammunition never ran dry. Mexican defenders who ventured to firing positions were met with canister shot, tin cans packed with lead balls that turned cannon into short-range shotguns, spraying death across the ramparts. Where were they getting the powder? The shot? Mora had fought under generals who rationed 10 rounds per gun per day. The Americans seemed to have infinite ammunition. They fired hundreds of rounds before noon and showed no signs of slowing. By afternoon, sections of the wall had begun to collapse. Not dramatic breaches, just steady erosion, like ocean waves wearing away a cliff. Lime dust settled over everything, coating uniforms a ghostly gray and filling mouths with the taste of burnt chalk. The metallic tang of torn lead mixed with cordite smoke and the sharper smell of human fear. Mora rotated his men every hour because the noise was literally maddening. The concussion rattled teeth and made ears bleed. Men vomited from vertigo. Others simply sat with vacant stares, unable to process the relentless mechanical violence. That night, Mora wrote in his journal by candlelight in a cellar beneath a convent. His hand trembled slightly, and not from fear. The guns speak without pause. We thought they would fire, rest, fire again. Instead, they maintain a drumbeat of destruction that gives us no moment to think or repair or breathe. How can they sustain such firing? Where do they store such quantities of shot and powder? This is not warfare as we understand it. This is something else entirely. The bombardment continued through the night. Pale flashes of muzzle fire lit the sky bright enough that civilians trapped in the city could read by it. The ground-shaking thuds arrived a heartbeat later, making adobe houses shudder and roof tiles cascade into streets. Mexican gun crews tried to return fire, but their 17 functioning cannon were positioned behind embrasures for defensive work, not sustained counter-battery fire. Each Mexican gun might manage 4 or 5 shots per hour. The Americans were firing 20 times that rate. It wasn't a duel, it was execution. By March 24th, 72 hours after the bombardment began, sections of Veracruz's historic walls looked like broken teeth. The Americans hadn't stopped firing, not once, not for meals, not for darkness, not for rain. General Morales called another meeting in the cellar. Officers arrived covered in lime dust, eyes hollow from sleeplessness. The continuous thunder of artillery made the floor vibrate beneath their boots. They cannot maintain this, Morales insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. No army can. They will run out of powder. They must rest their guns. They must. Mora looked at the faces around the table. They were all thinking the same thing. What if they don't? Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your location. I'd love to hear from viewers around the world. And if you're finding this story as fascinating as I do, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most stunning moments. 3 days later, with walls crumbling and civilian casualties mounting, Veracruz would surrender. But the psychological damage went far deeper than broken stone. Mexican officers who survived the siege carried a terrible knowledge into every subsequent battle of the war. The Americans didn't fight like other armies. They fought like a machine that never needed to pause, never ran out of supplies, and never showed mercy. And the thunder of Veracruz was only the beginning. April 18th, 1847. The road from Veracruz to Jalapa, Lieutenant Antonio Ramirez watched the American column approach through the morning haze and felt his stomach tighten. He had heard the stories from Veracruz survivors. He hadn't believed them. The mathematics of sustained artillery fire would prove more devastating to Mexican morale than any battlefield defeat. And the lessons learned on this dusty highland road would echo through every engagement until Mexico City fell. Ramirez commanded a company of light infantry positioned in the hills above the National Road, part of General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna's defensive line at Cerro Gordo. His men were a mixture of conscripted farmers and veterans, armed with whatever the government could scrape together. Some carried British muskets left over from the Independence Wars. Others had captured American carbines with mismatched ammunition. 3 men in his company were barefoot, their shoes having disintegrated during the forced march from Mexico City. The American supply trains stretched for miles. Ramirez counted the wagons through his spyglass, losing count after 200. Each wagon was drawn by teams of mules or oxen, organized in perfect columns with military precision. Between the wagons marched companies of infantry in blue wool uniforms, their muskets shouldered at identical angles, their boots raising dust clouds that hung in the still air. But it was the artillery that held his attention. Battery after battery of brass cannon, each piece drawn by 6 horses, each caisson loaded with shot and powder, each crew marching alongside their guns like priests attending sacred relics. Ramirez counted 14 batteries before the column disappeared around a bend in the road. That was nearly 80 guns. More artillery than the entire Mexican army possessed. His sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Delgado who had fought at the Alamo, spat tobacco juice and laughed bitterly. They bring their whole country with them. We bring courage and empty bellies. The smell of the American column reached the Mexican positions before the sounds did. Horse sweat, leather, gun oil, and the yeasty scent of fresh bread from the field bakeries that traveled with each regiment. Ramirez's men, who had eaten nothing but tortillas and beans for 3 days, watched with hollow eyes as American soldiers chewed hardtack and salt pork during brief rest stops. General Santa Anna had positioned 13,000 men in the hills around Cerro Gordo, blocking the road to Mexico's interior. The terrain was formidable. Steep ravines, thick chaparral, limited approaches. Santa Anna was confident. The Americans would have to attack uphill against prepared positions. Their artillery would be of limited use in the broken terrain. He was wrong on both counts. The American commander, General Winfield Scott, sent his engineers forward. Among them was a young captain named Robert E. Lee, who would spend 3 days mapping routes through terrain the Mexicans had deemed impassable. Lee found a path through the ravines that would allow the Americans to position artillery on the heights overlooking the Mexican flank. On April 17th, Mexican scouts reported Americans dragging cannon up slopes so steep the guns had to be dismantled and carried in pieces. Santa Anna dismissed the reports as exaggeration. No army could move siege artillery through that terrain. By dawn on the 18th, 6 American batteries had materialized on positions the Mexicans thought unreachable. The bombardment began at sunrise. Ramirez was drinking coffee. Real coffee, a luxury he'd saved for weeks, when the first shell screamed overhead. The explosion came from behind him, from the supposedly secure rear position where Santa Anna had placed his reserves. Before he could process what was happening, the second shell arrived, then the third. The rhythm was identical to Veracruz, mechanical, relentless, unceasing. The American guns had been positioned with surgical precision, targeting not the Mexican front lines, but the roads and trails behind them, cutting off retreat routes, disrupting reinforcements, sowing chaos in the rear areas. Shells burst among supply wagons and ammunition limbers. Horses screamed and bolted. Men scattered, seeking cover that didn't exist. The Mexican artillery tried to respond, but their guns were positioned for frontal defense, unable to elevate or traverse to engage the American batteries on the heights. Within an hour, 3 Mexican cannon had been destroyed by counter-battery fire so accurate it seemed impossible. Ramirez crouched in a shallow rifle pit as American infantry advanced under the cover of their own artillery. The shells arrived in a carefully orchestrated pattern, high explosive rounds clearing defensive positions, followed by advancing skirmishers, followed by more artillery walking ahead of the main assault. It was warfare as choreographed ballet, each element supporting the others with practiced precision. A cannonball struck the stone wall 30 yards from Ramirez's position. The impact produced a spray of fragments and that same white cloud of pulverized lime and burnt plaster that survivors from Veracruz had described. The smell was unmistakable. Metallic tang mixed with the acrid bite of black powder smoke and something else. A dry, chalky taste that coated the tongue and made breathing difficult. Delgado grabbed Ramirez's shoulder. "We need to fall back. The flank is collapsing." Ramirez looked to his right and saw Mexican units streaming rearward, not in organized retreat, but in panicked flight. The American artillery had opened a gap, and their infantry was pouring through. Santa Anna's impregnable position had lasted less than 4 hours. The retreat became a rout. Ramirez's company lost cohesion within a mile, men scattering into the chaparral or following whatever officer seemed to know where he was going. The American cavalry pursued, but it was their artillery that dealt the killing blow. Batteries that repositioned with terrifying speed, unlimbering and firing within minutes, then moving again before Mexican forces could organize a counterattack. By nightfall, Santa Anna's army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Thousands surrendered, thousands more deserted, melting into the countryside. The Americans captured all the Mexican artillery, 5,000 muskets, and enough ammunition to supply a brigade. Ramirez made it back to Puebla 3 days later, one of perhaps 5,000 men from Santa Anna's original 13,000 who remained under arms. He wrote in his diary by candlelight in a requisitioned monastery, "They do not fight as we fight. Each battle is not a test of courage or honor, but a demonstration of industrial capacity. Their guns speak continuously because they have ammunition measured in tons, not pounds. Their men march in perfect order because they have boots and rations. Their wounded receive medical care because they have wagons dedicated solely to ambulance service. We cannot defeat this. We can only delay it." The Americans occupied Puebla in May without firing a shot. The city's leaders, having heard what happened to those who resisted, negotiated surrender terms. Ramirez watched from a rooftop as American wagons rolled into the main plaza in endless procession. He counted supplies: barrels of flour, crates of hardtack, kegs of salt pork, bales of uniforms, cases of ammunition, medical chests, spare wagon wheels, horseshoes, nails, rope, canvas, lumber. It was the lumber that broke something inside him. The Americans carried spare lumber. They could rebuild damaged wagons on the march. The Mexican army couldn't even supply its soldiers with shoes. Summer brought yellow fever and dysentery. Disease struck the American army harder than Mexican bullets ever had, killing more men than all the battles combined. For a brief moment, Mexican officers dared to hope. Perhaps nature would do what armies could not. But even disease couldn't stop the American supply machine. Hospitals were established in Puebla and Veracruz. Medicine arrived by ship from the United States: quinine, laudanum, chloroform. Sick regiments were rotated out of the fever zones and replaced by fresh units. The army continued to function. By August, General Scott had reorganized his forces and prepared for the final push to Mexico City. His army had been reduced by disease to perhaps 10,000 effectives. But those 10,000 were fed, equipped, and supported by a logistics system that could sustain continuous operations indefinitely. Mexican defenders in the capital numbered over 20,000. They held fortified positions, prepared defenses, and enjoyed the advantage of fighting on home ground. It wouldn't matter. The artillery was coming, and the artillery never stopped. September 8, 1847. Molino del Rey, 2 miles southwest of Mexico City. The stone mills stood silent in the pre-dawn darkness, and Master Sergeant Carlos Mendoza listened to a sound that made his blood run cold. American artillery crews moving into position, the metallic clink of tools, the creak of gun carriages, the low voices of men who knew exactly what they were doing. Within hours, Mexico would lose not just a battle, but the last symbol of its ability to resist, and the rumor of melted church bells would become prophecy written in iron and blood. Intelligence reports had reached General Scott's headquarters that the mills at Molino del Rey housed a cannon foundry, melting church bells into artillery pieces to replace guns lost at Cerro Gordo. The reports were largely false. Some bell metal had been collected, but no large-scale casting was underway. It didn't matter. Scott ordered the mills destroyed. Mendoza commanded the defense of the Western Mill, a massive stone structure with walls 3 feet thick. His 140 men were positioned behind loopholes and makeshift barricades. They had adequate ammunition for once, 300 rounds per man, and the advantage of fighting from prepared positions. The American assault began at dawn without preliminary bombardment. This surprised the defenders. Perhaps, Mendoza thought, the Americans would try a quick infantry rush before their artillery could deploy. Then he understood. The Americans didn't need to deploy their artillery. They had brought it forward during the night, positioning batteries within 300 yards of the mills under cover of darkness. The guns were already loaded, already aimed, crews standing ready with line stocks. The bombardment that erupted at first light was unlike anything Mendoza had experienced. Not the sustained pounding of Veracruz or Cerro Gordo, but concentrated violence compressed into minutes. Canister shot at near point-blank range turned the approaches to the mills into killing zones. Solid shot punched through stone walls that should have been impenetrable. Explosive shells detonated inside enclosed spaces, filling rooms with lethal fragments. The smell was overwhelming. Burnt powder, pulverized stone, the copper tang of blood, and underneath it all that distinctive scent of black, powder residue mixed with lime dust and human sweat. The air became a thick soup that coated the lungs and made every breath an effort. American infantry advanced behind the artillery, moving in coordinated rushes while guns fired over their heads. Mexican defenders who exposed themselves to shoot were cut down by canister. Those who stayed in cover were blasted by shells. There was no winning position, no tactical solution. Mendoza's position held for 40 minutes before a shell penetrated the mill's roof and detonated among the defenders on the second floor. The explosion killed 11 men instantly and wounded 20 more. Survivors stumbled downstairs, slick with blood, their ears bleeding from concussion, their uniforms scorched and smoking. The Americans took the Western Mill by 8 in the morning. The fighting moved to the Casa Mata, a fortified courtyard nearby, where Mexican forces made a desperate stand. The pattern repeated. American artillery positioned with brutal efficiency, firing until resistance collapsed, then infantry moving in to finish the work. By noon, it was over. American casualties, 226 killed and wounded. Mexican casualties, approximately 1,000, including 300 taken prisoner. The Americans had suffered their bloodiest single engagement of the war, but they had proven a crucial point. Even without sustained bombardment, even in close urban combat, their concentrated firepower could break any defense. Lieutenant Ramirez, who had survived Cerro Gordo and been reassigned to Mexico City's garrison, spoke with survivors that evening. They gathered in a convent that had been converted to a hospital, surrounded by wounded men who would never fight again. The floors were sticky with blood despite repeated mopping. The air smelled of carbolic acid and gangrene. They didn't need to do it, one sergeant said, his voice hollow. The foundry was barely operational. They came because they could. Because showing us they could was worth 200 of their own dead. That night, Church bells throughout Mexico City began to disappear. Not to foundries, those facilities had been destroyed or captured, but hidden in cellars and buried in gardens. The bells had rung for weddings and masses for generations. Now they fell silent, and the silence itself became a symbol of what was coming. The American artillery was only beginning. September 12th. Chapultepec Castle rose 200 feet above the surrounding terrain, a stone fortress atop a rocky hill that dominated the western approaches to Mexico City. General Nicolas Bravo commanded the garrison, fewer than 1,000 men, including 43 teenage cadets from the military academy housed in the castle. They had provisions for a week, adequate ammunition, and strong walls. They also had a perfect view of what was approaching. American siege batteries had been constructed during the night of September 11th. Engineers working by touch and whispered commands had positioned guns on elevated platforms that gave clear lines of sight to Chapultepec's walls. Ammunition wagons lined up in careful rows. Powder charges were pre-measured. Targeting stakes were driven into the ground. At dawn on September 12th, the bombardment began. General Bravo stood on the castle's parapet and watched the American batteries erupt in perfect synchronization. 14 guns firing as one, then reloading in practiced 3-minute cycles that never varied. The mathematics were inexorable. 14 guns, 20 rounds per hour, 12 hours of daylight. 3,360 rounds would strike Chapultepec before nightfall. The castle's walls had been built to withstand musket fire and light artillery. They had not been designed for sustained bombardment by modern siege guns firing 24-pound balls. Within 2 hours, visible cracks appeared in the outer walls. By afternoon, whole sections had begun to crumble. Inside the castle, defenders huddled in interior rooms as shells penetrated the roof and detonated in corridors. The explosions in confined spaces were catastrophic. Pressure waves that ruptured eardrums and collapsed lungs. Fragment sprays that turned human bodies into torn meat. Medical personnel worked in cellars lit by candles, performing amputations without anesthetic because the chloroform supplies had run out weeks ago. The cadets, boys aged 13 to 19, manned positions alongside veteran soldiers. They loaded muskets with trembling hands, their faces gray with stone dust, their eyes wide with the knowledge that they were witnessing the end of something that could never be rebuilt. That night, the American guns continued firing by lamplight. Crews worked in shifts, some sleeping while others maintained the barrage. The castle's defenders had no such luxury. Sleep was impossible under continuous bombardment. Men simply collapsed from exhaustion, lying where they fell until officers kicked them awake. September 13th. The assault began at 8 in the morning. American infantry advanced up the hill under covering fire from artillery batteries that had been firing for 26 consecutive hours. The Mexican defenders, deafened and exhausted, managed only sporadic resistance. The castle fell by 9:30. 6 cadets died defending the colors. Young boys who chose death over surrender, their bodies found among the rubble of walls that American artillery had reduced to broken stone. Their sacrifice would become legend in Mexican memory, but it couldn't change the mathematics of industrial warfare. By afternoon, American troops had breached the western causeways and were fighting their way into Mexico City proper. The urban combat was vicious. House to house, room to room, bayonets and pistols at arm's length. But behind the infantry came the artillery, batteries positioned to sweep intersections and plazas, turning Mexico's capital into a killing ground measured in city blocks. General Santa Anna, watching from the National Palace, finally understood what Veracruz survivors had tried to tell him months ago. The Americans didn't need to be better soldiers. They just needed to be supplied soldiers, and their supply was infinite. That night, as fires burned across Mexico City and looters moved through abandoned neighborhoods, church bells that hadn't been hidden began to ring, not in celebration, but in lamentation. The sound drifted across smoke-filled streets where American sentries stood watch, and Mexican civilians huddled in cellars, and artillery crews cleaned their guns for whatever tomorrow would bring. The thunder had reached the heart of Mexico, and soon it would demand surrender. September 14th, 1847. Plaza de la Constitución, Mexico City. The American flag rose over the National Palace at dawn, and Captain Ignacio Mora, survivor of Veracruz, witness to everything that followed, stood among the defeated garrison and finally accepted what he had refused to believe for 6 months. Mexico hadn't lost battles. It had lost a war it never had the capacity to fight. The mathematics of that loss would reshape the continent, redraw maps, and haunt Mexican memory for generations. But the lessons learned under American artillery fire would prove universal and enduring. The plaza smelled of smoke, horses, and disruption. Cook fires extinguished too quickly, perfume from abandoned shops, the metallic scent of blood scrubbed from cobblestones, but never quite erased. American soldiers stood guard at intersections, their uniforms still crusted with the gray dust of siege work and urban combat. Mexican civilians emerged cautiously from cellars and convents, moving through streets layered with broken roof tiles, splintered beams, and the scattered debris of hasty evacuations. General Winfield Scott established headquarters in the National Palace and immediately began the work of occupation. Food distribution centers were set up to prevent starvation. Military police patrolled to prevent looting. Medical stations treated wounded from both armies without distinction. The organizational machinery that had sustained the American advance now pivoted to managing a conquered city with the same methodical efficiency. Mora watched American quartermasters' inventory captured Mexican artillery, 17 functioning guns, most of them obsolete smoothbores, poorly maintained, with mismatched ammunition. He thought of the hundreds of American guns he had seen, the endless ammunition wagons, the replacement parts carried in specialized supply trains. The disparity was so absolute, it approached farce. Lieutenant Ramirez found Mora on September 16th in a cantina near the university. They sat at a corner table with 2 other officers, drinking mezcal that tasted of defeat and silence. Finally, Ramirez spoke what they were all thinking. "We never had a chance, did we?" Mora shook his head. "Not from the moment they landed at Veracruz. Perhaps not from the moment the war began. We thought we were fighting an army. We were fighting a system. The system had crushed them, not through superior courage or tactical brilliance, but through the unglamorous mathematics of logistics. More wagons, more ammunition, more food, more everything. The American army consumed resources at rates that seemed physically impossible, and yet the supply never faltered, never even slowed. In the weeks that followed, Mexican officers were paroled and allowed to move freely within the occupied city. Many wandered American camps with the stunned fascination of men viewing artifacts from a more advanced civilization. They watched artillery crews maintain their guns with specialized tools and cleaning compounds. They observed infantry companies drilling with standardized equipment and identical uniforms. They saw field hospitals with actual surgical instruments and medicine. One officer, Colonel Miguel Hernandez, spent an afternoon at an American artillery park and returned shaken. He described ammunition chests organized by caliber and charge, spare parts inventoried and labeled, maintenance logs updated daily. "They treat their cannon like we treat holy relics," he told Mora. "Every piece documented, every round accounted for. This is why they never run out. This is why they never stop firing." The negotiations for peace began in January 1848. Mexican commissioners arrived at the talks knowing they had nothing to bargain with except the American desire to end the war quickly. Santa Anna had been removed from power in November, his reputation destroyed by defeats that seemed inevitable in retrospect. The new government faced the task of explaining to the Mexican people how a nation of 7 million had been conquered by an expeditionary force that never numbered more than 15,000 effectives. The answer, as survivors of Veracruz and Cerro Gordo and Chapultepec knew, was in the supply trains. The answer was in the artillery that fired without pause. The answer was in the industrial capacity of a nation that could fight a war on the far side of a continent and never worry about running out of food, ammunition, or replacement soldiers. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed on February 2, 1848. Mexico ceded over 500,000 square miles, nearly half its territory, including California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona and New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. The United States paid $15 million in compensation and assumed $3.25 million in Mexican debts owed to American citizens. It was arguably the most one-sided territorial acquisition in modern history, purchased not with money, but with the unceasing thunder of American artillery. Mora was present in Mexico City when the last American troops departed in June 1848. He watched the columns march out. With the same precision they had shown marching in, supply wagons in perfect order, artillery batteries positioned to cover the withdrawal, nothing left to chance. He thought about what he had witnessed. Battles decided before they were fought. Sieges that ended in days instead of months. A supply system so robust it could sustain operations across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. And above all, that terrible mechanical rhythm of artillery fire that never paused, never wavered, never showed mercy. Years later, Mora would write a memoir that Mexican military academies used as a textbook. His central thesis was simple and devastating. Modern warfare was no longer about courage, honor, or tactical brilliance. It was about industrial capacity. The nation that could produce more, transport more, and sustain more would win, regardless of individual soldier quality or defensive advantages. "We lost to the factory," he wrote. "We lost to the railroad and the steamship. We lost to the organizational systems that could coordinate thousands of wagons and hundreds of guns. Most of all, we lost to the mindset that treated war as an industrial problem requiring industrial solutions." The psychological impact of continuous artillery fire had broken something fundamental in the Mexican military psyche. Officers who had fought with reckless courage in earlier wars found themselves paralyzed by the mechanized violence of American bombardments. Soldiers who might have held against infantry charges fled from artillery that never stopped. The thunder had taught them they were obsolete. In the decades that followed, military theorists studied the Mexican-American War for lessons about industrial warfare. The continuous artillery bombardments at Veracruz became textbook examples of suppression fire. The lightning march from the coast to Mexico City became a case study in logistics. The concentrated firepower at Chapultepec demonstrated the future of siege warfare. But the deeper lesson was about national capacity. The United States had fought a war of conquest 1,500 miles from its industrial heartland, while simultaneously absorbing hundreds of thousands of European immigrants, expanding westward, and maintaining normal economic activity. Mexico had mobilized everything it possessed and still couldn't match American output. The guns that never ceased firing weren't just weapons. They were statements, declarations of industrial supremacy so absolute that resistance became psychologically impossible. Captain Mora died in 1863, having spent his final years teaching at the military college. His students asked him once what he had learned from the war against the Americans. He thought for a long moment before answering. "I learned that some wars are decided before the first shot is fired. That courage means nothing against endless resources, that the future belongs to nations that can produce, not just fight. And I learned the sound of artillery that never stops. A sound that still echoes in my dreams, reminding me that some forms of power are too vast to resist, too mechanical to reason with, too absolute to survive." The thunder of 1847 reshaped a continent and redefined what war could be. Mexican soldiers who lived through it carried those lessons forward, teaching new generations that modern conflict demanded not just brave men, but industrial systems capable of sustaining mechanical violence indefinitely. The artillery had spoken. The artillery had never stopped speaking. And in its continuous thunder, the modern world announced its arrival, measured in tons of powder, calculated in firing rates, victorious through logistics rather than glory. Some wars are won with courage, others are won with supply chains. Mexico learned the difference the hard way, one unceasing bombardment at a time. The guns fell silent in 1848, but their echo never faded.